Good afternoon. Is this on? Good afternoon, and welcome to this event on the implementation of the Common Core standards. I'm Mike Cohn from Achieve. In a moment, I will introduce John Bailey from the Foundation for Excellence in Education and Chiefs for Change, the organization with whom we are co-sponsoring this event. We're at a pivotal moment in education reform in this country, and the Common Core standards are playing a critical role in that. Achieve had the honor of working closely with NGA, CCSSO, and other organizations in the development of the standards, and we're working very closely with roughly half the states on supporting their implementation efforts on the Common Core. There are 46 states plus DC that have adopted the standards, and almost that many are participating in one of the two assessment consortia. There is a lot of work going on sparked by the development of the Common Core standards, and it's a lot of hard work that's going on. While this has been happening, there have been a number of criticisms of the Common Core. There were criticisms while they were being developed, and there continue to be criticisms. Among the concerns that have been raised are whether the Common Core standards really are as rigorous as they need to be, whether they're in fact internationally benchmarked, and whether standards really matter at all when all is said and done. What's nice about this event is we've got an opportunity to hear from Bill Schmidt at Michigan State. John will introduce him in a moment in more detail, but what's important here, just to frame this, is Bill is probably the foremost scholar on international benchmarking of standards and international performance in the country. He's been at this work for a very long time. Bill and I first met in the 90s talking about this work, I think. In his continuing academic research, he's going to share with us some of his latest findings, and what he's going to talk about is, first and foremost, that the Common Core standards in math, which is his specialty, in fact, compare quite favorably to standards in high-performing countries around the world. Secondly, standards, in fact, do matter. You can see a real connection between the rigor and focus of the standards and possibilities for student achievement. But thirdly, standards aren't self-executing. They need to be implemented. And people are hard at work at that, and Bill's research has pointed out some things that we all need to keep in mind as we focus on the implementation of the Common Core. So I just wanted to sort of make those few comments to set up this session, and would now like to call on John Bailey from the Foundation for Excellence in Education and Chiefs for Change. For those of you who don't know John, he works with Dutko Gray. Did I get that right? Dutko Gray as an advisor. He was formerly served in a number of positions in the Bush administration, including in the Domestic Policy Council. He was director of technology for the federal government while he was in the Bush administration. He was a technology director in the State Department of Education in Pennsylvania. He's served in a number of other state roles throughout his career, and he's now a key advisor to Chiefs for Change. So, John, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you on behalf of Chiefs for Change. Thank you for having us have the opportunity to host this event and to be here today, and I think to hear some really important research that comes again at a critical time in the standards and education reform debate. Our chiefs, which are 9 state chiefs from all across the country, ranging from Louisiana to Florida, all the way up to Rhode Island and Indiana, New Jersey, they know that employers and post-secondary institutions are asking for the same expectations of readiness for students across state boundaries. They also know that there's widespread support for standards that are clearer, more concise, and more rigorous, because standards are what provides the foundation for other reforms. In many cases, it's these academic standards that were begun as state standards back in the 90s and now have become common standards as part of the Common Core that build the education platform for most of the other education policies and reforms that our chiefs are pursuing, whether that's teacher effectiveness, whether that's accountability, or whether it's targeting interventions to turn around low-performing schools. It all begins with what is it that we're expecting of our students, of our schools, of our teachers, of our states in terms of improving that education. That's why the research you're going to hear today is so important, because Dr. Schmidt's research shows that state leaders are on the right track. especially with the implementation of this Common Core. The Common Core standards really do have the potential to raise student learning, to raise student performance, and his work confirms that the Common Core is competitive with other standards in other countries, and that if you can reach those standards, you're going to be competitive as a student with students all across this world as they compete in the global economy. And so that the Common Core is an improvement in many ways over a lot of where current state standards are, especially in the math area, which is just such a critical skill going into STEM jobs and competing in this innovation economy. The challenge moving forward is implementing the Common Core standards in an intentional and thoughtful way. As the Common Core documents maintain teachers know their students and know how to best support them, we need to trust the Common Core and empower teachers to select the tools and strategies they believe will best help their students meet and even exceed these rigorous standards. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Bill Schmidt. Bill is one of the preeminent scholars in math and science education. He previously served as National Research Coordinator and Executive Director of the U.S. National Center, which oversaw the participation of the U.S. In the TIMSS study. He has published in numerous journals, including the Journal of American Statistical Association, the Journal of Educational Statistics, and the Journal of Educational Measurement. He has also co-authored 7 books, including Why Schools Matter. His current writing and research concerns issues of academic content in K-12 schooling, assessment theory, and the effects of curriculum on academic achievement. He's also concerned with the educational policy related to mathematics, science, and testing in general. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Schmidt. Thank you.
Sticking in my back.
The standards are fine, the technology not so good.
I was wondering what was poking me in the back. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I thank both of your organizations for giving me the opportunity to present some results of research that we've recently done at Michigan State with my colleague Richard Wong. They've actually stolen my opening lines, which were that, we have established these standards. We have 46 states now working to implement them. So I think the time has come to really look more seriously at some of the issues surrounding these standards, especially as Mike said that several states are actually sort of saying, well, should we really be doing this, or should we pull back and not actually implement these new standards? So I have been working on this for some time. Independently of all of that, I just decided it was time academically to look further at the issues surrounding the Common Core, having been involved in TIMSS, the study that sort of laid some of the groundwork for the ideas that helped these people, the NGA and the Council of Chief State School Officers, to actually move toward developing those standards with the chiefs and others' help. So what I would like to do is share with you a set of results that I think are important to look at and to think about. The things that I want to talk about, both of them already said. These are summarized here as, first of all, and then I'll explain and give you the results and the data that supports these particular points. These standards are world class. And I think that's particularly important because in today's world, and for a long time since TIMSS, people have asked the question of me, are our standards world class? And the definition of world class was often somewhat fuzzy in many people's minds, but actually we have data from the countries, the 40-some countries that we studied, and we're able to identify what that looked like. And so now I can tell you when we look at these and compare them formally, statistically, we do have world-class standards in place. They can potentially elevate the academic performance of our students. I want you to pay particular attention to the word potentially. I'm not going to stand here and say I have the answer that they can. How could I do that? They haven't even been implemented yet. But I will share with you an analysis that I've done, which I think has something to say about this issue. Most states have a long way to go toward implementing these standards. Some less, some are closer, but some are quite far away. The teachers and parents are overwhelmingly in support of these standards. We've done some surveys of parents and the public, and I can tell you, and I will share with you results that show how strongly that support is in place. But I think the one group we haven't paid enough attention to yet is, can we convince our students as well that this is important for them to know? That is just a caution. I do not have any results on that. But basically, I think that becomes an important issue that needs to be thought about. Well, in that international research that Mike talked about, that I was involved in, we came to the conclusion, when looking at the very top achieving countries, those whose 8th graders performed the best, there were 3 main characteristics that distinguished what they did in their standards from what we and many other countries did. That we identified focus, staying on a small number of things, coherence, the fact that mathematics is logically constructed, you can't just arbitrarily teach things in different order, and thirdly, that they're rigorous, that in fact they moved from the early grades up to the middle grades, and the middle grades were really more about algebra and geometry, no longer more about arithmetic. So we learned all of that, and it was best represented symbolically by this little graphic, which lists the names of the mathematics topics in the rows. They're not important. The pattern is what's really important. And you have 8 columns representing the 8 grades. I'm only going to talk about the Common Core with respect to the first 8 grades. And so therefore, what you see here is a distinctive pattern. The pattern is coherence. The topics at the bottom of the list aren't covered until the ones at the top of the list are first covered and introduced. The focus is represented by the small number of topics at each of the grades, especially at the early grades. And the rigor is, if you look and could read, the topics at the 8th grade are more about algebra, geometry, trigonometry, slope, some very difficult concepts. So this became sort of a metric called the A+ standards, the international benchmark, which many states worked with from about 1998 onward in terms of reforming some of their standards. But just to remind you of what we have moved from, I thought that little historical perspective might be worth noting at least. This next slide shows you for how many topics at particular grades did all the states call for their coverage in their state standards. The black dots represent all the places where we had uniform agreement in this country. The pause is to say what? There are 6 that we could agree to teach a particular topic at the same grade. So when you were talking about having common standards across your 9 states, the 50 states, that's hardly possible. The open holes have to do with the places we do agree. We very intelligently agree not to teach slope, for example, at first grade. We all agree on that one. So this actually sets the situation that those who undertook the development of the Common Core and wrote those, which I was not involved in that process directly, they actually were confronted with this reality. And this is the thing they had. Now, just a quick diversion for a moment, just a little minute, and that is, I think many people think of the Common Core as an attempt to improve performance of the students, their achievement performance. But there's another aspect of common, which is important, which is common. That is, they're intended for all students. This slide shows you the inequality that's inherent in the American public educational system, where simply there isn't anything that you can expect that all children will necessarily experience in the right order at the right grades. That, I think, is a rather serious problem in our educational system, which simply further exacerbates differences across social class groups in terms of what we expect them to learn. I don't intend this as a commercial, but a book will be coming out called Inequality for All that I've written, which shows the data, which would scare you if you saw the enormous inequalities that exist within this system. And so the Common Core is also intended to address that kind of an issue. Well, the next thing we did is we actually, using the very same TIMSS methodology of coding, we took the documents from the Common Core and coded those. And I just want to make one really important point. All of what you're seeing was not somebody's opinion about whether the Common Core is good or bad or indifferent. They really simply were graduate students given the job of coding and finding out what topics were taught at what grade levels. The analysis, the statistical analysis, is the means by which to make the points that I'm about to make. Well, here's the graph that represents the Common Core state standards in mathematics. And you can see a very similar sort of shape to this, to what you saw with the earlier slide with the A+ or the top achieving countries. So this alone suggests a great degree of conformity between the two sets of standards. But the real issue is let's see how much they can simply actually be consistent. And so basically, the next slide you'll see, do you notice the gray, the shaded area? That's the Common Core. So I'm going to put that on the next slide, and then the dots on the next slide will be the A+ or the top achieving countries to get a real simple look at the overlap between the two sets of standards. And you can see there's a tremendous amount of overlap between the standards. If there's one thing the Common Core does that's a little different from the A+, is they tend to introduce more topics a little bit earlier, especially in the earliest grades. About past 4th grade, that's not a characteristic, but in the 1 through about 4, you have that one tendency. But we have a measure, which I will describe in a moment, but you'll understand these words. Basically, we found that these are 90% consistent with each other. And the changes that there are often things, there's always some slide room. Nothing has to be exactly the same. Nobody ever said you should be exactly like an international country or anything of that sort. It's the pattern that particularly counts. And so basically, a 90% consistency, I think, leads to the conclusion that we have standards that are very coherent, focused, and rigorous. And in fact, it is time to simply stop talking about them and debating it and simply move to the real serious implementation thereof. These are world-class standards. We have a great deal to be proud of as a nation, and we owe a debt of thanks to those who worked so hard, the governors sitting out there politically and the chiefs, and those who then actually wrote those standards. We owe a debt to them for that kind of monumental work, because I think, as I will show you in a little bit, it can make a difference. To the focus issue, let me just pull that out separately. How many topics are covered? Why is this important? Because if you have too many topics at a grade level, you can't focus on anything, and you have to keep repeating them, and you end up with many more topics at any grade level simply because you have this redundancy that you have to build in. The first thing I just ask you to look at is the progress. It's just kind of nice to do. From 1995, when we were back and doing the TIMSS work, look at the 8th grade. There were 34 topics at 8th grade. Now we're down to around 20 topics. That's the scale of the quest for focus that we as a nation have undergone, and it's progressed very nicely. But most importantly to you is the top 2 rows, where you have the A+ and the Common Core. And you can see they're almost identical. They vary by 1, 2 topics. In some case, at least one grade, the Common Core are more focused than the international standards. So basically, they are very focused. They have, the writers accomplished their goals of making them coherent, consistent with international benchmarks, and quite focused. Then I want to turn to, that was that first bullet I gave you, to the second bullet, which is the potential that these have for actually affecting, if implemented appropriately, the student performance. And I have to pause here for a moment because I want you to understand exactly what we did before I give you the results. You know, the fact that what I just described to you, that our new Common Core standards are very consistent with the international, and actually we compared them to Singapore and a few of these countries. I don't report that because I don't like to encourage people to think about those kind of silly comparisons against one particular country that's a city-state, for example, with a whole nation. I mean, these are silly comparisons, so I much prefer to stay with the aggregate. But basically, the fact that our standards are so consistent with the international benchmarks is it one thing to take into note when we address the second question of do they make any difference. These were the countries who have the top achieving 8th graders. So the fact that ours are now consistent, one would think that's certainly an encouragement right there as to the fact that these should help our students perform better, especially if you believe that schooling matters, which I truly do, and the data is overwhelmingly supports that particular point. But we wanted to go further than that. But to do that, it's impossible at this point to actually show it with the Common Core because they're nowhere fully implemented, and it would be a silly analysis to attempt something of that sort. So what we did is to approach this in a somewhat novel way. We decided that what we would look at is to try to simulate what this relationship might look like in terms of data that we currently have. So what we did is we know that there was a NAEP test given in 2009, and that gives a measure for every one of the 50 states. But we also know from previous study that we had done around 2007 that we looked at an international study of teacher preparation. As a part of that study, using the TIMSS methodology, we coded the standards of all of our states again. So we actually had that coding done according to the TIMSS methodology from the original time. So we had those two sources of data. And we decided then to try to, as I said, simulate this thing by taking each state, and we made the following assumption. Some of these states would be, some will be closer to the Common Core than others. And therefore, what we could do is we said that those states whose standards at that point in time, leading up to 2009, that were more similar to the Common Core would most likely be reflective of what it would be like in a state where Common Core standards were in fact in place, at least certainly more so than relative to those states whose standards were quite far away from where the Common Core are. And then secondly, an attendant assumption is in those states where that is the case, presumably those standards then are impacting what teachers do in the classroom, and therefore you would find that the actual implemented curriculum in these classrooms in states that are more similar to the Common Core would find actual content coverage, the implemented curriculum actually being implemented much more consistently with what you would expect from the Common Core states once that is fully implemented. So making that assumption, and it is an assumption, I want to emphasize that, making that assumption, we then proceeded with this following kind of analysis. The first thing we needed was a measure of consistency with the Common Core standards, so that if we took a state and we drew a picture like the pictures I showed you for the state, we needed some metric that would allow us to compare the state against the Common Core. Those are kind of geometric shapes, and I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but we developed a measure of congruence, where we simply developed an overall index that showed how close, you can think of it as a distance measure, or you can think of it as a degree of similarity of the Common Core standards to each of the 50 states. Basically, what it took into account is when topics were covered too early, introduced too early, when they were kept in the curriculum too late, whether they were covered when they shouldn't be by the Common Core, and where they were covered places where they didn't cover things where they should have been covered in the Common Core. So we took those kinds of basic objective characteristics and developed this particular index. And that's what we then used, and that is what then leads us to the conclusion that we found, and that is that the states with past mathematics standards that were more similar to the Common Core standards, we found a statistically significant higher performance on the 2009 NAEP. I want to be very clear to all of you, this is not a causal inference. It does not suggest that this is exactly what will happen when we implement the Common Core, but it surely gives a sense of what it might be like, because the logic and the assumption I ask you to make is not that sort of unreasonable, that those states which are similar to the Common Core would surely produce better, perform better, their students would perform better than other states where that was not particularly the case. So that's sort of the basic assumption we made in this analysis. But I think we also need to think about what this means a little bit further. Standards, be they the old ones or the Common Core state standards, are pieces of paper. They really, in a certain sense, wouldn't have any kind of relationship to achievement. They actually have their relationship, I hypothesize, and I think there's substantial work to support this, is indirectly through what happens in the classroom. We know enough that we know that where the learning takes place is in the classroom as a teacher and a student encounter a particular topic and a subject matter and set out to learn that topic. So these standards impact that which happens in the classroom, which then directly is related to the student achievement, and there surely is a lot of literature that shows that last arrow is the case. What we unfortunately are dealing with is that we are going from the standards directly to the student achievement. What I would love to have is an implementation measure of each of the states in terms of how much they had implemented their standards for this analysis, and ultimately, I guess what I'm suggesting is the nation ought to think very seriously about one of the most important things they could do, perhaps even more importantly, and this will shock Mike when I say this, even perhaps more importantly than the assessment. Because initially we want to see whether they're actually implementing these things, because that's how the achievement will ultimately be impacted. Actually, I'd like both. So what I want to point out here is that when you think of this relationship, relationship, you have to think of this little graph. And then I would say, think of the following, that when we look at this relationship, when I say that the standards are related to the performance, it really means all the stuff that goes on in the state associated with those standards, the things you see on this paper. In particular, assessment. We all know the assessment. It's the common statement. That's what drives what teachers do. And so basically, these kinds of whole attendance set of activities is what really is probably represented in that relationship of the standards to the achievement. Now, having thought that through, then we thought, well, is there a way to improve this analysis? Then look at it in a more sophisticated way, because the first way was just to relate that measure of congruence to these 2009 NAEP results. So what we did is we looked for something. We don't have a measure of implementation, but we could look at factors which could influence that implementation. The first one is a state policy. Every state has an assessment. They have to go through the rigors of setting a cut point, which defines proficiency, other levels as well, but I'm going to just focus on proficiency. And so therefore, where that cut point is set, we believe sends a message to the teachers. If that cut point is set reasonably high, it says to the teachers, this is important. You should implement this because this is what we're going to test the kids on. And in the No Child Left Behind era with student accountability, and school accountability, AYP and all of that, I suspect these teachers pay great attention to that. And there are data that also from the literature that supports that particular point of view. So the state assessment, where they set that cut point, becomes important. So what we did is as follows. Every state has an assessment. They have their own cut points, right? They were wildly all over the place. But the NCES has given us an equivalent of that on state NAEP. And so what we did was take that and say that we formed a ratio of the state's proficiency cut point, the equivalent proficiency cut point, and we put it over what the state says, the state NAEP says is proficient. So it's a ratio. It's a proportion, actually. And so we weighted the congruence measure by that. So whatever the distance was, we just weighted it by that measure. So if the proficiency was defined highly, there's no change. But if you have a very low cut point, it knocks down the effectiveness of your standards. It knocks down that measure of congruence to a lesser number. So that's what we did there. Then secondly, again, searching for something that would help us to account for the difficulties that in implementation, we found two measures that we used which were available, a measure of poverty and a measure of the percent of low income, actually it's white low income family students attending public schools. Reasoning that if you have a high concentration of low-income students and poverty students in your state, it becomes very difficult to implement standards, especially if they are highly challenging standards. So we use this as another indicator of the difficulty in implementation and built a new model, a statistical model, taking these things into account. The first thing we did, though, was to simply take the first of these. We took our simple proficiency measure, and we then reran that analysis and looked at that. And what we got there is that the R squared, and think if you're not familiar with the statistical term, when you try to do these regression things, which is sort of fitting points along a line, the closer if they all fell in line, you'd have 100% of the variance accounted for. And what you want to get as close as that you can. In social science research, you're lucky if you get 20, 30% typically. So what we got when we did this is a 12% increase when you move to the cut point being an additional feature. So when you begin to take into account the implementation, you find the relationship smoother. More of the points are closer to the line. It's a better fit. It works better, the analysis. So actually it went from about 20% of the variance accounted for, which is amazing, with only one variable across the states to account for their achievement differences. And then when we put the cut point in, it went up to 32%, which to me is quite amazing. Not just because I did it, but just because that's a big number. I didn't do it, it was in the data itself, I just discovered it. But that's a rather large percentage of variance accounting for just a single variable. Think about that, it's accounting for almost a third of the variation you find among states in 2009 in the state NAEP results. Now, I can illustrate this in another couple ways, I think, which is kind of interesting. First of all, let me tell you that, when we look at this, well, actually, I'll talk about that in a minute. Let me just finish this part with the following, and that is when we fit this now model where we actually put all three of those variables, the congruence measure, adjusted for the cut point, and the two variables that account for social class differences, what we find is the following statistical analysis. All three of the variables are highly significant. The model is highly significant. We account for almost 70% of the variance now, which is quite a very strong, nice fitting model to these data. And the congruence measure adjusted for the cut points is still statistically significant. So even when you account for poverty that exists, the differences across states in poverty and social class, you still find that these state standards, their congruence with the Common Core and adjusting for the cut points does make a difference. So it's the same point I made to you earlier, only now more strongly one can account for the variation among the states in terms of their performance. So this leads me to the conclusion that I said to you we're starting out on, for this second bullet, to look at a hypothetical situation. It is hypothetical. It is not causal, I will again make very clear. I do not believe this proves the point that the Common Core standards are better and will improve, well, I'm not making the point they'll improve achievement, but what I'm saying is this seems to be very encouraging news, that in those cases where states were closer, you take into account the difficulty of implementation, we find that there's a very strong, very nice fitting relationship that accounts for the state NAEP results. And I suggest that that foreshadowing, that simulation, should be hopeful, that in fact there is a strong potential that we in fact will find that these Common Core standards will help to us as a nation to improve the academic performance in mathematics of our students. There's the good news, I think, that's very powerful. But again, it is not causal. It is only potential. It is only a simulation. It is only hypothetical. You might think, why does he keep saying that? Because I do not want to be misunderstood, misquoted, and essentially take what I think is a very interesting result and turn it into something that it's not. Having said that, I want to speak to the issue of the states themselves. I had the privilege of talking to some governors recently to help them think about some of this. But this then looks at this measure of consistency now. It's the third bullet, that some have a long way to go, some less. How consistent are those standards by that measure of congruence to the Common Core? They range from, converting into a percent metric, from about 66% consistent to about 83%. Remember, the A+ was 90%. So there are a few states that are reasonably quite close to where you would like to see them be, but some of our states are quite far away in their comparison. And let me show you this. I'm sure you'll all be trying to squint and see which ones are which. But basically, it starts from the bottom, those states which are the furthest from, up to the top, which those states are most consistent with the new Common Core state standards. There are some things that are not particularly surprising. There are, I'm not sure I get the right ones here. There are the following states: California, Georgia, Indiana, Washington, Florida, and Michigan. Those 6 states are in the top category. Those 6 states have all been given A's, or some version of A, by the Fordham Foundation. So it's not that inconsistent at that level with what their own work has shown. And these 6 are among the top 8 on the measure of congruence. So that's one point that's simply worth noting. You can also look further and see the range of states. Those on the bottom: Arizona, Nevada, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Rhode Island, Wisconsin, are some of the states that are the furthest away and would have the longest way to go. Probably the single biggest type of problem with respect to these state standards in terms of being consistent with the Common Core state standards has mostly to do with one characteristic. It's the age-old problem which contributes both to a lack of coherence and a lack of focus. The introduction of topics way earlier than they should be, because there's not the necessary prerequisites in place to simply have them learn those topics, something we identified way back in 1997 when we released the TIMSS results. Then that still seems to be the predominant problem, that the notion in this country, it's attributable, in my opinion, this is an opinion now, not data-driven, it's one of two things. It's this spiral curriculum notion that we introduce them and then just sort of spiral them up, or it's just this notion that rigor, being tougher, is to introduce things earlier and earlier on in the curriculum. Whichever the motivation, it's a really bad idea. And basically that's what that's the biggest problem in terms of the states that are the furthest away from the Common Core. There are other problems of skipping certain key topics at key points. The one that comes to my mind is the coverage of the principles and the properties of whole number operations. If you don't understand that, you're going to have a serious problem going on in mathematics. And yet that's a topic that is fairly regularly omitted in many state standards. So this gives you an idea of how the range is. Another point I just might make to you is the cut point. I thought this was particularly interesting. Massachusetts was a state that many of you, if I ask, you would think, oh, they must have good standards because they perform very well on state NAEP, et cetera. Well, their standards did not fare well in this congruence measure. And when we did that, they were somewhere in the middle of the pack, I think about 24th. And in fact, though, when we adjusted for the cut point, they shot right up to third, because they're the one state whose proficiency definition is equivalent to state NAEPs. And so you have that. It's a nice illustration of the impact. Now, it doesn't make theirs better. It makes everybody else's worse. I hope you realize that, okay? Which isn't exactly a really strong statement. Now, on the other hand, and I feel okay in saying this, probably my governor won't like this, but in the state of Michigan, Michigan's standards were very high. They were fifth in looking at their standards. I mentioned before that they gotten an A on Fordham, and they were very high in this congruence measure. However, they have very low cut points. They've just changed it, thank goodness. But basically, their original cut point defined proficiency at the equivalence of somebody getting 39% correct. So what happened to them in this measure when we adjusted for the cut point? They went from 5 to 28. So the measure seems to reflect realities, is the adjustment and so forth to this analysis, which I think, to me, as a statistician, gives me some comfort, because it's a validation of sort. It makes sense to what one's perception of what the reality might be in such a situation. Before I go any further, I just want to say one other thing about this whole area with the achievement, and then I want to move to the implementation part very quickly. And I know this is just as hypothetical as this whole analysis in a certain sense, but I think it's quite interesting. I did the same exact analysis once I figured out this methodology for getting a measure of congruence. I did this very same analysis against the 30-some countries, looking at their degree of congruence with this. And I found a very similar relationship, very strong, positive, statistically significant relationship. So you see the parallel both within the country and across countries. But you know, when you do that kind of thing with, regression analysis, you can play with it. You can simulate something. You can take and put a new number in something and see what it predicts. So what I did is I took the US, now we had a measure of congruence there, which was pretty bad in the original 1995 study. So I put the new Common Core measure into there, okay? Into that regression analysis, and predicted what our achievement this is for fun, would have been back then. It's the power of statistics. You can play all kinds of games. So what would the performance have been for us in 1995 TIMSS had we had these Common Core standards in place? Again, just a notion. But if you do that, we went from 28th out of 41 countries, which is where we were at 8th grade back then. We would zip up to sixth place with those kind of standards. Just gives you an idea to think about, okay? Doesn't prove anything. Now I want to move to talking about the actual implementation just very quickly. This is another set of results we got from, we've done some really serious work about this whole implementation issue. I am only just touching on a little bit of what we've learned, but there'll be some really interesting stuff coming out of this study, I know already. And I want to tell you a little about where the states are in terms of what they've told us. We did a study in 40 states. That's how many had adopted the Common Core at that point. We took a random sample according probabilities proportionate to size within each state of districts. So we're representing each state. So we have a set of results that could be descriptive of each state. It's national in terms of 40 states, but it's about each state individually. And then we took a random sample of teachers. We have a sample of over 600 curriculum directors and 13,000 plus teachers from whom we have these data. The data were collected just this past spring. And here are some results from that study. I have some good news for you, some bad news, and to coin a phrase or to steal a title of a movie, and some ugly news. First of all, the good news. 90% have read them, have heard of them. They've read, 70% have read at least their part of them, and more than 90% like the idea. They really support the notion of how we're not fighting the teachers. No matter what some might tell you, that's not the issue. The teachers are on board. They want to do this, they believe it's a good idea, and they think we should move forward. That's the really good news. The bad news. We actually did this on a website, so we knew what grade the teacher was teaching. So we then asked them, showed them a set of topics right out of the Common Core, okay, right off the pages of the Common Core document. And after they read those topics that they were supposed to teach for their grade, 80%, yeah, it's the same. We do that, we can do that, it's the same as it is. Translation, most of these teachers do not recognize the train that is about to hit them if they simply really seriously are going to implement these standards, especially in the middle grades. This is also disconcerting that when you ask them if there's a topic that they currently teach has been moved to a different grade, would they move it? Or what will they do? No, only about a fourth would drop it. In other words, even though it's in that other grade, they'd still keep teaching it at their grade because they've been teaching it at that grade and they want to keep teaching it at that grade. Well, the next part of I said it's the ugly news. I was being cute, obviously. But what I want to say here before I show you this slide is now I want to tell you what the teachers say they feel, how well they feel prepared academically to teach these topics. And I do not cast dispersions on the teachers as I show you this slide. This is what we have created with the certifications that we have set by states, by the colleges and universities who have simply done what they have done in terms of the education of future teachers. But the reality is about a half of them feel not prepared to teach this in the first 5 grades. You get into the middle grades, about 60% feel well prepared. Excuse me, well prepared, and in the high school, even somewhat surprising, only around 70% feel well prepared. This is what they're telling us, their own self-assessment. It may be worse than that, but this is at least their judgment. So in my sense of this is these teachers are excited about this, they want it to succeed, they want to do it, but they recognize they don't have the background mathematically to do it. There's the dilemma, there's the thing that we will have to confront in order to be able to move to a solution. And in closing, I'll just tell you something really informal, and that is that what we have found in this research that we're doing currently, it's still going on, I don't have any summary to give to you, but something that's happened, which I think is encouraging, especially after this slide, and that is that basically, when you make these teachers aware of what they are doing and how it relates to the Common Core, you get big changes already quickly. We actually gave 400 and some teachers iPads. And it's a great inducement, by the way. We told them if they did what we wanted, they could keep them at the end. What they had to do is every lesson in math they taught, they had to record on this touch screen. We built an app to do this. You touch what you're teaching, takes you down through the levels of the Common Core, and you hit the one you're teaching, tell us how long you teach, et cetera, a few other questions. Basically, what we have found, the curriculum directors and principals of those districts, this is the worst nightmare of a scientist. You know, you always worry that when you measure something, you'll change it. That's the worst thing that can happen. Well, that's what's happening. They're now getting all excited about this. They're talking about it. They're changing. They're forcing meetings of the principals to talk about the Common Core. They're getting much more knowledgeable about the Common Core. So it's screwing up my research. But basically, it's really shows you that these teachers, it's the slide, they want to do this. And if you just get them to engage in it, and if daily they have to think about what they're doing relative to the Common Core, they start to get it. Now, those are just informal comments, but I think that's an encouraging note. And so that brings me full circle to the fact that what I started, and I think those are the things we've learned, and I hope they're useful to the nation to think about the next set of steps. I guess I would summarize it this way. We now know that they work. They have the potential to work, I mean. We now know that they are world-class, and we know that people want to change. And so therefore, we simply have to help this. And I think it's quite honestly, my opinion, is we should stop fighting about this and just start the serious work of implementing, because I think we're on the right path. Could they be slightly different? Yeah. Might they be better in a certain way? Yeah. But we have something that's certainly worthwhile to move on and to move now. And to not do so leaves our own children in jeopardy. So I think we need to move and move now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill, for that sort of tour de force through the quality, rigor, and implementation issues in the Common Core standards. We have time for a few questions, if there are. Jerry?
Would you
Just tell people who you are, where you're
Oh,
from,
I'm-
and a short question, so we give other people
I'm
a
Jerome
chance.
Dancis. I'm a retired mathematics professor. Would you talk about the last two slides? Because on the one hand, you have 80% of the teachers saying that Common Core is pretty much the same, but you only have half the elementary school teachers saying they feel well prepared to teach it.
Oh, okay, I think I understand your point. Because in another study that we did unrelated to Common Core, we found the same thing. Teachers told us that this was before the Common Core. When we asked them about the topics in the curriculum, they told us they weren't academically prepared. So I think they have felt that way all along, and now they probably feel it worse and more seriously, because especially the middle grades, the topics have changed quite appreciably.
Thank you, Bill. Other questions? Yes, sir. Identify yourself, please.
Jimmy Bell, American Principles Project. I'm sure you guys saw the Brookings Institute report, and it called into question in its data analysis some of the assertions about those other countries that you referenced as A-plus countries, in fact being much better than the United States, and said that it looked like from their reading of the analysis that the United States is performing at least equivalent, possibly around at least equivalent of those countries that we've long considered to be high-performing countries. Could you comment on whether you factor that in somehow when you were looking at the A-plus countries and how that affected your statistical analysis?
I'm not sure what you're asking me to factor in.
Well, I mean, they essentially, obviously, you had an aggregate of countries that you mentioned earlier that you said that you were referencing to say, all right, these are countries that we know are definitely doing superior to us on, performance measures. And the Brookings Institute recently, obviously, just this year, came out with their education report that said that the degree to which the United States is underperforming academically against its foreign international competitors is much less than was previously thought, and in fact the United States may be par or equal to its competitors. And I was wondering how that might affect your analysis if in fact those A-plus countries were not much better than us, as Brookings suggested.
Unless I've read a different report, I don't recall that statement in the Brookings report, but I'll respond to it in case they did, or at least your interpretation of that. I would just like to know on what basis, what data would tend to show that. I know the data. I was involved in its collection. I know what it implies. I know that we sit, I told you, that 28 out of 41 in the original TIM study. I know of no data which shows that what we're performing at a level commensurate with any of these top achieving countries. I can tell you, for example, the more recent studies show that even if you take our top 10%, they're in the middle of the distribution in Japan, Hong Kong, and some of those countries. So I just, and I don't know that, in one sense, we know that we're not satisfied. Only 25, 30% of our students are proficient in our NAEP test, our own test. So we already know that we're not doing particularly well. So to me, if one wants to quibble about differences among the countries, it still comes to the same picture. We're not doing as well as we should be doing. And what we can learn from those countries that did do better than us is this, which makes logical sense. The other powerful aspect of this is if you bring this to mathematicians, they say, that makes sense, because this is the logic of the discipline, and therefore there's little evidence to support the way we do our curriculum, no matter what the metric of performance. And I think these standards are consistent with what makes logical sense as well as empirical sense.
Just to underscore what Bill said from a different perspective, because I know of no international studies that have us ranked near the top, whether it's TIMSS or PISA. But if you just look domestically, right, 40% or so of first-year college students are required to take remedial courses because they can't meet college-ready standards. That has nothing to do with the rest of the world. It has to do with how we perform against our own standards here. And from that point of view alone, we have a long way to go. There's no room for complacency. Other questions?
He, I think, had a follow-up.
A rejoinder?
Yeah, just a quick one. I think some of the things that they did was they held constant income, and also they factored in something that hasn't been factored in all the studies, which is that many of our competitors, Germany and Japan and others, don't have all of their students taking the tests. In other words, they bifurcate and they select some of the students to take those tests, and they factored in some of that, and with that new data, they came to that conclusion.
Well, you're doing okay until you hit that last point, because I can speak to that as a professional statistician. That's simply not true. These countries were required at 8th grade to meet a standard of 90-some% of all the eligible students at that age, could only eliminate those with severe disabilities. I can tell you that that's simply not true. There is no way that that's true on these new TIMSS or the PISA tests. They are run by statisticians who actually check to make sure each country's response sampling frame actually is consistent with and covers at least 90% of their population.
Thank you. Another question?
Hi. Cindy Hasselbring, math teacher from Michigan, but currently an Einstein Fellow at the National Science Foundation. My question is, with so many states using the ACT as an assessment tool, has there been research done to see how the Common Core aligns to the ACT?
I know of none. I haven't at least done it. So there may be somebody that's done it, but I'm not aware of it.
Question there? Or an answer?
Well, not an answer, really. A couple of years ago, I was involved in a.
Could you actually just introduce yourself, please?
I'm Susan Wildstrom, and I'm a high school teacher in Montgomery County, Maryland, and I'm
Great.
not here for any particular reason other than I knew that it was happening.
That actually is true for everybody here.
Okay. I guess it's because I don't have a lot of professional connection with what's going on. Just an
You
interest.
teach.
I do. I teach high school math. Lots
So
of
you have
it.
a lot of professional connections.
Exactly. A couple of years ago, I was invited to go to Iowa City, where ACT and NAEP were running a sort of a parallel joint, you know, what do we teach, what do we test, what do they test, kind of a study. So my guess is that something is being done to try to look at how ACT is going to line up against CCSS, but it was done from NAEP, from NAEP's point of view at that time.
So it's also the case that the folks who developed the standards look very carefully at evidence from ACT as well as from College Board to see what those tests, this is more at the high school level, but which is relevant to you but not to the K-8 stuff, looked at what those tests measure and how they predict success in post-secondary education. So that data played an important role in the development of the Common Core.
I would just add that I would hope that ACT, what are those called, college placement, the placement ones. What
Yes.
is- Yeah, the tests.
Compass. Active
Compass
placement,
and,
yes.
those, that they also would all line themselves up eventually. I mean, I think that's something that would be hopeful, that the whole thing would line itself up appropriately.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Mike Kessner. I'm currently the branch chief for mathematics at the Department of Defense Education Activity. Question I have goes back to your first slides in talking about the coherence of the standards. most of what you had were content topics. And what I hear a lot of the states focusing in on now are those mathematical practices. Was that part of your analysis as well?
No, the short answer. The reason is because internationally there are no data that make that very easy. We actually looked at that. I can tell you that the standards, the Common Core standards, have about 10% well, the metric's hard to explain, but every topic has some kind of practice associated with it typically. And so basically about 10% are at the highest level. But I don't have a metric to say that that's comparable or not comparable to other countries. But that's part of what we're doing in the study we're doing right now within the classrooms, where we're trying to actually look at that and measure that. And it's very difficult to measure. But it is an important part of this. It's just that I focused on the actual content coverage.
Okay. Other?
Sharon Hesney. I work for Senator Franken as an Einstein Fellow, and I'm a Boston Public School high school teacher. Two of the factors that you adjusted for, poverty and non-poor white, address exactly the achievement gap. Do you have any comments on the size of those effects and how it relates to the achievement gap?
Not directly, because I wasn't looking at the gaps, but I think others have pointed out most recently that the racial gaps, the black-white gaps, are narrowing over the years. But the income gaps, the social class gaps, are getting larger. And I think that it is apparent from the data with those strong relationships that the states that have that kind of situation within their borders, that those are the ones that are going to have the most difficult time implementing something this challenging. I think that's what that analysis tends to show, that the biggest challenges sit for those particular states. Do you want me to tell you? It would not surprise you. It's pretty much along the southern tier. I don't want to name all, but it's Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Nevada, Oklahoma. If you go west, and those are. A lot of them are of the southern states that we know have operated under that shortage for some time.
And many of them also have the lowest standards.
No, you'd be surprised. Actually, those states have really high standards, and that makes that's how we came to this need to adjust for this kind of implementation, because many of those states, like Tennessee was another one, has very high standards. They were like up in the top. I don't remember exactly. Well, you'll probably somebody will quote me, so I better look at my. Where's my piece of paper?
Your piece of paper is here.
That's my piece of paper. Well, I can tell you exactly because I wrote it on this piece of paper because I thought somebody might ask me. Tennessee went from 15th. If you simply, actually the cut score is what affects this one. They went from 15th to 49th. If you on the measure. But those states, a lot of those states that I described, are in the bottom of the per capita income distribution in this country. We found that I think it's 10 of the ones that were in this particular shape with high standards, relatively high standards, above average standards, but didn't perform very well. Those were the ones that were also in the bottom 15 or so states in terms of being at least some $5,000 lower than the average for the U.S. of per capita income. So that's why we control for that, because of the issue that in that situation, highly challenging standards are probably going to be very difficult to implement.
Thank you. I have a question back there.
Hi, my name's Melissa Tooley, and I work on educator quality issues at the Education Trust. And my question goes back to one of your original slides around inequity in the current standards and how not all students are being held to the same level of rigor and challenging coursework. And it sounds like, given that many teachers feel unprepared to teach the new standards, that could potentially be an issue here as well, that different students are still receiving different levels of rigorous coursework under the new standards. And I want to just hear your perspective on that, and also if you think that's true, what should we be doing to try to ensure that doesn't happen? You talked a bit about teacher preparation in terms of new teachers, but in terms of our current teachers already in the classroom, what would you recommend?
I fear that you're right. The inequalities that permeate the system go down to the very basic level of whether a topic is even covered or not. We have those data at the teacher level. And most of the variation in that book I cited, we did an analysis that shows most of the variation is at the classroom level. And so therefore it's about the decisions that are being made in the classroom as to what should be covered and not covered. And we have data that actually shows in that same book, this is not related directly to the Common Core, but it shows that in fact there are huge differences across the classrooms related to social class. The one that strikes me is that in 7th and 8th grade, algebra-related instruction, 5 weeks more in the suburban wealthier districts than in the low-income urban districts. So there are these enormous differences, and that's why the common has to be understood to not just mean common across the states, but the purpose of this is, at least in my opinion, is common across every classroom in this country. But that will be a very large challenge. What you can do about it, I mean, the problem is we have such huge differences in the teachers we prepare. I'll go there because we just recently did a study of this. And so that we have this enormous difference in terms of, we actually tested these future teachers in their last semester of college. And what they know about mathematics varied enormously. And the question is, where do they then go? And I don't have the, well, actually I do have the data, but I haven't analyzed it yet. We followed them up and we do know where they went. But I suspect that this doesn't distribute itself evenly across the social class dimension. And so that just is another foreshadowing of the kinds of problems we'll have. And I'll tell you a scary statistic. That if you take the bottom quartile of these 81 randomly sampled public and private universities and colleges that prepare teachers just a couple years ago, if you take the bottom quartile in terms of what they know about mathematics, they prepare over half of the future middle school teachers. So the problem is big.
Bob?
Thanks. I'm Bob Rothman with the Alliance for Excellent Education. I was at a education conference recently and walked through the exhibit hall and saw all the vendors with big signs saying our materials are Common Core ready. I was wondering if you or anyone would be prepared to do some analysis like this to evaluate those claims.
How public is what I'm allowed to say?
Just speak into the camera.
Oh, what the heck. That is probably one of the greatest collection of snake oil salesmen you will ever find. I mean, I think literally in East Lansing, a week after the Common Core had been announced, somebody was there saying their new Common Core aligned books. Come and hear us talk about it. I've heard from teachers that some of the series put out a book, a separate little, not a book, but you know, what do you call those things? Yeah, and a paper kind of thing, yeah. And a paper book, that's I guess I'm trying to say. An addendum that just, you're supposed to take that and that makes then this 800-page book work. Now, I will tell you this.
How does that do for the focus part of it?
Yes, I was just about to say, if you look at the fact of the Common Core and what they've done, and that one slide that showed you how many topics at each grade level, you don't need a 400-page plus book at 4th grade or an 800-plus page book at 8th grade. So if they're coming and selling you anything that big, that's just skullduggery. It can't be aligned with the Common Core. It's just nonsense. So I honestly, I actually go around the country talking to districts, and I tell them, don't buy anything. Just don't buy any books. There's none yet out that are ready to go, and you just waste your money.
So on a more uplifting note for a second, but not inconsistent with what Bill said, Achieve has been doing some work in this area. Last year we started working with 3 states, New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, that have won Race to the Top funds. And we're allocating a portion of that to develop model curriculum and instructional materials aligned to the Common Core. And in working with those states, we help them develop some tools and rubrics for evaluating the alignment and quality of instructional materials. We've been piloting it in those states. There's actually a group of folks in Boston today working on English language arts. I don't know if there's a math group going on at the same time, but these tools are being developed and piloted and perfected to enable educators in states to use them to evaluate the quality of instructional materials. Some of this will be materials that the states themselves are paying for, but once you've got tools to evaluate material that can be used to evaluate open education resources and other kinds of materials, and the idea that we could have, based on the Common Core, a common set of tools to judge the quality of instructional materials means we've got the ability to improve them over time and to make wise decisions about which ones to use. So that's coming. We've actually got, I think, about 20 states, teams from 20 states coming to meet with us in a month to learn how to use those tools, to pilot them themselves. So there are ways to judge the alignment and quality of what's out there. We have time for one more question.
Bill, it seems that one big concern with implementation is teacher readiness to teach to this level. What advice would you have for institutions that prepare teachers?
Okay, well, I think that they need to think very. The one principle I took away from the international study that we did do on this particular thing is that you have a limited amount of time, just like you have with kids in the K-12 system, and it's a matter of how you allocate that teacher preparation relevant coursework. One thing we learned is that in the top achieving countries, where top achieving means both that their teachers were on the high end of the distribution and their kids, about half of their coursework was in the middle school. Now I'm talking. Now I'll go back to the primary. Is in real mathematics, and about 30% is in math pedagogy, and then about 20% is on general pedagogy. In the U.S., that flips quite a bit. It drops down to 30 or 40% math, and about 30% that, and the rest is general pedagogy. So I think there's a real issue of how they should think the allocation of that precious time when they prepare teachers. It seems, at least from an international point of view, we do way much more with general pedagogy, classroom management, that kind of stuff. And we should perhaps focus more on the mathematics, both the pedagogy and the actual content itself. In the middle school, in the elementary school, we're fairly consistent internationally. I'll tell you what the real issue there is, and that is that it's who comes into teaching, I think. These other countries, remember, their 8th graders perform so much better than our 8th graders. So when you draw from that distribution, you're going to end up with people who know more math coming into teacher preparation. And that seems to be more the issue at the primary level, is who we're attracting in terms of mathematics. I mean, these are good people, but in terms of their mathematics backgrounds, we need. Now, one alternative approach that some countries are now moving to is they actually have much more, they actually have specialists all the way down at 4th grade, and maybe even in some cases a little bit lower, that teach the math. And, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it makes sense. If not everybody wants to be interested in teaching mathematics, it might be better to think around some kind of solution like that. But teacher preparation, I think that, the first thing that probably needs to be done, and there's a movement in the country right now, is we need to clean it up a little bit. We have institutions putting out teachers who should not be. They're just not doing anything with these people. They're taking advantage of education to, what is the phrase for that, cash cows to feed the rest of the university. I mean, this is serious. And I think that should be taken. States have that responsibility. They can move on this by their setting of standards, and they really need to think seriously about who they're certifying to be the teachers of their own children within their own state. I think that's something that really, and that affects the universities, which then have to adjust their standards and requirements accordingly. So I think that's probably the biggest policy lever there, is to go at reducing these places or eliminating these places that are doing such a poor job.
Bill, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And also, please join me in thanking John Bally and the Foundation for Excellence in Education for co-sponsoring this. Thank you all.